Hi, welcome to D10tion, where we pretend to know what we're talking about when it comes to D&D. I am your host, I Just Live Here, Tristan. To my left, we have Destiny Sam, and to my right, we have Fate Brandon.
I'm down with that one. That's one of the good ones. That's a good. I'll take it. I'll happily.
Okay, now you gotta change it.
Yeah, now I gotta change it to something else.
No.
Fortuitous, Brandon.
Nope, too late. It's already fake.
No, it's fart now. You're a fart, Brandon.
Oh, man.
So, today we're going to start delving into the idea of campaign building. Now, this is something that I personally don't have a whole lot because I'm not a DM, because it looks like a lot of work.
It is.
Yeah. No. So, if you're looking to become a DM, this is a good place to kind of see how our two main DMs have kind of gotten into it. So, we're going to go over kind of starting with a couple of 3 topics here to kind of start delving into how they became building and campaign
how we became
building.
DMs and how we build campaigns.
Right.
Which is different from each other.
Yes, because they both have very different styles because they're very different people. So let's start with today's...
No, we're the same person. Duh.
So we're going to start.
So we're going to start today with something that, you know, is a good idea to... This is where you start, but this is not where you start.
No.
We're going to start... So today's first topic is story. Now, this is where if you're trying to come up with a campaign, what the overall arcing story is more or less, or at least the first arc. Is what my guess is when it comes to this topic.
You're just staring in the dark. I want you for the rest of this episode to just take guesses on how we do it.
That's exactly.
I will let you know if you are correct or not.
I like this game.
This is a fun game for us.
All right. So my guess is Sam thinks of a story and goes, haha, it's going to suck for them. And Brandon's going to go, haha, it sucks for them, but it'll make a great story.
It'll be fun for me and hopefully fun for them. Probably make them not happy. But fun.
All right.
Well, I think we agree with that.
Yeah.
You want to make a challenging story. You want to make something that's not the typical. I mean, unless you want. If you're starting DM, go for it. But I don't like to do a princess is in a castle guarded by an evil dragon. Go and save her.
Well, that's a mission. That's all that
A
is.
dragon is in a
can be a
castle
story.
guarded by an evil princess. Go and save the dragon.
All right. Well, then, okay. Well, since this is where Sam starts, why don't you tell us, Sam, how you start with the story? Like, your way of either coming up with the story or how that plays into your campaign building.
Okay, so when I first start building a campaign, I think of a story. I think of, like, all right, what are some possible, like, big bads? What are some possible situations going on? And I tend to do that first, but I know that you do things differently. So what do you do different?
When I start the story, I start it this big and then grow it. Because I like to think of what can I challenge them with at the beginning and work the story there. And then most of the time the story there will grow into a larger story, but it doesn't always have to. That's why I start with a small story. Because if it's a small story that gets the group together and bands them together to go out and explore and find the greater quest, then that's fine, or it can be built upon. I always start small at the base and then get larger. I make my story, my crumpled up pile of paper that I toss stories larger and larger. That's how you want to think of it.
Whereas I go the other way. I start large and I work my way in.
Now, it should be stated that this is a great way to start off if you're trying to do a one-shot. Now, I know we're campaign building, but for one-shot, I would imagine starting with just a simple story before you start going into the other things is probably a great way. So if you're looking to start small with like one DM, maybe a one-shot, starting with a story is probably the best way to start.
Yeah.
If you're trying to make up your own one-shot, that is.
You're trying to make up your own campaign.
Right.
This is based on making your own.
Right. So when you're making a story, I guess... Where would you guys mostly get your inspiration? I know originally when you were going to start doing a campaign, Sam, you had started with the idea of a one-shot, which then delved into going that's too much for a one-shot because you wanted to explore it more.
Right.
And I know when we were originally talking about it, it was dealing with stuff like with Greek mythology and really expanding on it because you were going to do a one-shot that dealt with a labyrinth with a minotaur.
Yes. So my thinking process is very, very erratic. So like, I started off thinking like, oh, let's do a one-shot with like a minotaur and like a labyrinth, and then like that just totally wound up being something completely not that. I tend to like jump from idea until I finally rest on something, but I'm like, okay, let's go with this. So
No, that's not a bad thing, especially if you're struggling to come up with an idea. Starting with an idea, something like that, like, hey, it'd be like even if you're even like starting off with thinking of like, okay, how would I design a one shot? What would be a good idea for a one shot? And then going, how would I expand on that from here? Is probably a good way to develop a campaign story overall. If you're looking to, much like Brandon, start small and expand, but just using it with a story perspective versus like, here's an overarching story right out the gate. How do I make this happen? So yeah, you're pretty erratic, and I've been there with you most of the time when you come up with stories, whether you're your own personal ones or for D&D or just random characters that will never see the light of day.
Yeah, most of those are.
You are very erratic. It's just whatever pops in your head, then changes it, or you talk to other people and see where you can go from with there.
Yeah.
So you have very little rhyme or reason.
Which is very different, because normally in my life I'm like a type A personality, but like
Everything fits in the box.
any story ideas that I have, it's totally chaotic.
So that brings us, how about you, Brandon? When it comes to developing a story, do you do the same thing where you start small and expand? Or do you have an idea that's like, this would be hilarious, or this would be a great idea to make this into a story, and then
When initially coming up with a story, I try and think of either a cliche or a stereotype, and I think of what I can do to personally change that or add to it and morph it into something more personal that's an experience for everyone. I'm definitely one of those people that when I write the stories and I make it, I make clear-cut decisions. I'm like the opposite of you. I don't go erratic. Whenever I think, I go, okay, how is this going to fit into the box? How am I going to make something out of this and grow from it? So, for example, when I started the campaign that we're playing currently, I thought of how can I establish and make a world where there is an underlooming threat that can interact with everyone independently and as a group, and that has grown. I start with, like I said, like a small thing, like a concept, small threat, or threat, interacting with the group. And then I grew from there, but it was a clear decision I made. I had other ideas of, is it just an adventuring party? Or are you stuck in the servitude of something else? And things like that. And I make a clear decision on what I want the anchor to be. And then I grow from there.
So it kind of feels like you start with more of almost an emotional feeling versus it seems like you start with something more tangible right out the gate. More or less, just from this conversation here. Yeah. Like yours is like, this is the threat. What do I do with it? Versus this is the feeling. How can I make that a threat?
Yeah. Dude, for sure. When I write these stories, it's all about, I want the emotion. I want players, and you guys have several times to go, what? Or to be like, and those are what I make the story for. How about you?
What do I make the story for?
For funsies.
To kill the players. No.
For funsies.
No, for funsies. I think usually when I think about, like, when I finally settle on a story idea, then I sort of get into the, like, okay, how does this story affect the world? How does this story affect the players? Then I start breaking it down. So for me, it's like I do eventually get to like the emotional
it's just you don't start with
of it. It's just I don't start there and work out. I start out and work in. And for me, that's just how my brain processes things.
Which is fantastic to meet another DM who does the opposite of me.
Now, my guess is, just as you guys, as DMs, you guys will probably typically, despite the fact that the characters play a major role in these conflicts, they are not characters designed to be the end all be all. They're not like the chosen one for everything. I imagine you guys tend to lean away from that, because I know personally for me, those stories get old so fast. Of
like players, you make players the chosen one. Or like
yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the bad guys are bad guys. They can be the chosen one. That's fine. But it's like you see it all the time in everything from video games, books, and stuff like that. It's very much like, I am the chosen one, born for prophecy, blah, 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 versus like, hey, we are people that live in this world. We want this to stop. We should probably do something about that. Not to say that you're not going to have different, side missions and whatnot where that might not be the case. Like, oh, this deals directly with your family, but the overall story, I know. I mean, and this could be different, but as a player, a particular player, I always hate the idea of like, well, so and so is the chosen one to save the world from everything, and then that ends the campaign. Versus just living in a world that might have some issues that maybe world ending, but you have a group that are trying to stop it, but the reality of them dying or not getting that goal is definitely an option versus like it's going to happen.
So how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think that there's something to be said about like having a certain special quality with a player, or like maybe some sort of like uniqueness. But there's definitely not like when I start thinking about a campaign, it's like you are not the only person in this world that could potentially solve this problem. Like that would be kind of dumb. I think. Just.
I make worlds that don't give a crap about people.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is like where we've seen like people who try to come in and be really edgy, or like, oh, I come from the sky in a big comet and land with my giant sword, and then they, the DM's usually like, well, now you're dead.
Well, you landed, you died. Or I'm super edgy, and I go, well, let me just take out some sandpaper of the world and smooth that out. That ain't
real
gonna fly.
because like with D&D, we're building a world that, as players, that you feel realistic in versus like always being that chosen one. It adds a little bit more emotion to
Some people do the chosen one aspect because that gives players to feel like I'm important, which is good. It's not bad to do that. It's just you can't do it in a way where it's I'm important. Everything else is meaningless.
And that's kind of what I mean. Like, it's one thing to maybe give them a title or give them like a job or something that's a little unique or a little like independent. But I mean, if you just like sit there and you're like, you are the only person who could stop this big bad threat.
Cool. Now everything other problem is useless.
Yeah, and that's my thought, because it's the thing of it, if like either A, that character always has to have plot armor that never lets them die, or if they die, then the campaign feels like it's automatically
or it
over.
kind of like rubs other players the wrong way. Like if you only have one player that's like a special, like, and the other players are not special.
I mean, it's either A, you make the whole party like it's a prophecy that the group comes together to end all evil or something, or you have to have players that are fine with being the person
being a side character. No one wants to be a side character.
So, I mean, I think we've kind of gone through a lot of story elements.
And the bare minimum of how you build a story. We can go into more depth later.
Yeah, story is always a big thing, because story has so many different things. Because, there's talking about, like, what happens when you meet the final climax, you continue or start a new story, or what have you. But all of the things are going to involve with the next topic, because everything about this story takes place in a world.
In a world.
Now, when you're building a world, then of course this is where Tristan takes a stab in the dark about building a world. You want to build a world, in my guess, is that is realistic enough to make sense for things, that exists all the time, regardless of where your players are, as well as things that make sense in general, like just normal functioning. Whether it's
a town can't subsist on a economy of rats.
Yeah,
that doesn't make sense.
I mean,
it can.
It could. If you're living in like a heavily rat-populated world, maybe.
But like in a regular world,
or at least a continent or something that's just
a continent made of rats.
Like that'd
be an interesting. I'm gonna have to write that now.
So imagine building a world. The world building, I imagine, is probably a bit more thought than the story, because the story is there. Because then you have to make a world fit the story at all times.
Not really.
A world's a world. My idea of a world being existing is a world's a world. Things happen in the world, but whatever event is happening. It can happen depending. And most anywhere, you fit the world you make the world to fit the story.
You also have to think about it this way: the world in and of itself is it's static. Whereas like the story is very fluid and changing, and there's like a billion different opportunities and possibilities.
And also in Dungeons and Dragons, there's different planes of existence.
Right.
So your one world may not be any sort of consequence.
Yeah.
And you could go to the Feywild, which is a whole trippy situation, or you could go to a different plane of existence, or you could go to the plane of Mechanus. Like any of those things, you can bend and twist on, but your world existing, it needs to function. Like you said, it needs to work as a world. But there are ways, since you are the deity, you can mold the world however you want. Right. You can make the world, if you have your story set out, you can mold the world and put interesting things in the world after you've made the plot. Because you control it. If you need to change things around, if you can, like let's say your players don't know that there is another continent, and they want to go to it. Well, I didn't plan another continent. Well, give me a session. Bop. Now there's a continent that exists. It didn't exist before, so I didn't plan for it. But I'm able to mold the world until you give your players a map. You're able to mold the world as you need. Like, let's say they don't know there's a mountain range, and they're like, let's go that way. And you had a plan for a dungeon over here, and they want to go over there. Well, you just because they don't know that where these things exist. So the world can
Until you give
shift
them the map.
based on until you
Yeah.
give them a map. When you give players a map, your world's set in stone.
Not
How about you?
Well, even then this is just a wrong map.
What are you gonna do? Just a wrong map or shift reality?
Or I would say more or less like,
Outdated map.
so for example, I give you guys maps when you guys
Yes.
play my campaign, but that's just that map. I mean, for all you know, that's just like one little corner
Yeah.
of the world.
I'm saying,
You know
but
what I mean?
that's what I mean. When you give
That's
them a
as
map,
far as
that
anyone's
area is set in
explored.
stone.
Yes. But see, I like that because for me, like doing something like that, it kind of helps me because of the way my brain works. It helps me keep track of all the shitty little ideas that are in my head.
Well, because I also think because with the maps that you give us as players, you also go like, here's the map of the world that everyone knows at the moment, but this is how much of the map that you actually know exists.
Yeah.
And that's where we have to differentiate between players and characters. Like, my character knows that much of the map, whereas your character might know that much of a map, whereas the map is this big. And like whatever map we've seen is still only maybe that big. It's like seeing a map of the United States for us at any given time. And whereas I might only know like a
East
state, you might know
Yeah.
the country. Whereas people are like, okay, cool. What about the continent? What about this hemisphere? What about
The tectonic plate.
yeah, or even the maps because there's always a retcon of saying, well, that map was made 100 years ago and nobody thought to change it, so no one knew about this mountain range over here or meant to do anything, and you can retcon certain things or what have you. I imagine like you said, you can warp reality to whatever you need story wise.
How long does it take you to make a map
How long?
in a world?
Okay, so to make a world, much longer. To make a map, not that long at all.
Put things in the map. That's one thing.
To put, I mean, like I could if just drawing out a map, like I usually just like.
Squiggle, squiggle, squiggle.
And then like, and this is here, and this is here, and this is here, and there's stuff here, and this one's like this, and this one's like this, and this is the temp, like this is the, like a day to make a map.
Right.
Like
Well,
it really
this
doesn't
is-
take me that long.
This is definitely where you can see there's that viral video or GIF or whatever you want to call it, where it's someone has like a handful, big old handful of dice, and like, oh, all the D4s will be bodies of water, like lakes or ponds or large bodies of water, and then like certain dice mark different areas of like outreaches, and they just shake it, and throw it all like on a whiteboard or a
Which
poster.
I personally have never tried, but have been sorely tempted to.
As have I. Like if I think because developing a map, why is that what
No,
you
go
did?
ahead. No.
I was going to
Oh,
say,
hell
no. That's something that I think would be a great idea to build one. Like, especially if you're like, I don't know how to build a world or map or whatever. You can be like, all right, well, let's see.
Yeah, until you wind up with like a mountain and an ocean. I mean, which you could.
No, it's easy. That's a
Yeah.
pretty cool thing.
Yeah, you just draw it.
There's
right
nothing
at
in
the
a
base
fantasy game like D&D. There's nothing that could come up on a map that you couldn't work around.
Yeah,
do
that's
magic
true.
or something.
Yeah.
Like. I just do it differently.
Yeah.
That's
How do
all
you
I-
do it?
So when I make the map and the world, the story's made. I know what I want to feel. I know what I want them to do. In the general gist, we're gonna get to how that changes because the story's gonna change, no matter how good of a planner you are. Then I think, okay, now what do I want to be? What do I want to get from the world? What do I want the players to get emotionally, get in their minds, get from the world? And then I build from there. And I'll build it as realistically and magically as possible. That's why in our campaign you have that map, and then there's the large whirlpools in the middle of continents, and you guys are like, what's that? I did that very deliberately. It wasn't like, oh, I feel like that'll be that. No, I was like, okay, I want to add this facet. I think of the facets and the ideas and the concepts and the like cities types that I want to add, or in the environments that I want to add, and then I piece them together in a way that is a coherent like existence. So I'm not going to be like, here's a desert, all right, and there's a large body of water for no reason, and there's a forest right there, and I try and make it so geographically it'll blend, like, and I do that very specifically and on purpose.
So, I mean, it should be, Marty, if you're trying to look at maps and world building in general, it wouldn't hurt to actually look at real maps and kind of understand a little bit of
Yes.
actual,
Cartography and
cartography.
geography.
Right. I mean, because there's countless map builders online. There's, you just Google, like, map builder.
This is world map. We're not talking dungeon map. That's a whole different.
Well, yeah, that's a whole. That will be on another episode of campaign building. I think. That will be like session building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Yeah, but like there's countless, it's the internet. You have different tools, different mediums. Because
things you
even
pay for
something
that are
as
free.
simple, you're right. You can even like pay other people to have you do it. Like you go onto Fiverr and go, I need a world map. And here's a couple of ideas I have. Could you make a map based off of some of these ideas? And then
It'll be a
someone's
great
like,
looking map.
Like, blah, 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 blah,
I
blah,
love
boom.
making maps though. I
Right.
think it's like I just really enjoy it.
I like making maps to a degree because I don't like setting the world in stone because who knows if some idiot's going to be like, I want to go over there now. And it's like, well, I didn't plan for that. Now I got to
See-
change the world.
See, I think that's why. I think that's the differences between you and I. Like the main difference is because you tend to like freeform things a bit more, whereas I like
Type A person.
There is that. There is that road that we're taking.
Like, or it's more like I like knowing. So like if a player is gonna like let's say for somehow or another they wind up teleporting themselves just to another like continent. Like I want to know what's already there, what type of government systems in place. Like is there anybody there who's of interest, or what's going on currently in that. Like I like knowing all of that ahead of time.
Right. I mean,
So that way, if I do come across that situation, I'm not sitting there like, so there's a guy named Lewis, and you know what I mean? Like it's already there.
Yeah, because
I
even if you already
a plan.
have that whole other world plan, you as a DM, you can have that whole other continent at a freeze as far as storyline wise. I imagine, so you can be like, well, we're not even going to be there.
typically, but yeah,
You
But
can for ease.
You can, yeah.
If you're like, okay, cool, my players aren't going to be over there for probably the next year or so, like in game time.
Nothing's happening there right
Yeah,
now.
they're never going over there. You could be like, that's all at a standstill for whenever they get there. But then if something like that happens, where you're like, oh, I've been teleported to the other continent, you're like, oh crap.
And then as far as like changing situations or like for lack of a better word, like retconning things, like you could even if you already had something planned, like you can just change it there and then. But it's easier for me if I already have a basis to work with.
And this is where I imagine, like, if you think of like fun side missions that you would have your group do, like oh, somewhere blah 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 over there's this whole thing that your party's probably going to get to, or even if your players see a map, you're like, what's that? And you explain it, they might be more likely to do it. You can build, even if it's not part of the grand scheme.
tunnel full of chocolate and candy and
Right,
wonder
you get there into
And
giant
beholders.
and beholders and
Yay.
leeches.
Yay.
Or and this will lead into our next topic. Or if you're talking about your characters' backstories, you may have to alter things slightly to incorporate something where, like, a certain race that they want to play, it has a specific land they would live in. Like you may have an area like, well, they wouldn't tip. They was like, oh crap, I didn't put an area where they would come from. You may add it into it then.
Which is exactly why backstories are part of this. We'll talk about character and teams and like all player stuff, but backstory is important because we're talking about story in the world. It doesn't make sense for what would be an easy one. Let's say it wouldn't make sense for a mountain dwarf who's in your party to exist where there are no mountains.
Yeah. Unless
There's some reason. But that's why backstory is important to it. Because if, let's say your player's like, I come from a mountain family. Well, now it's good to know beforehand that they're planning on playing this, because then you can build your story in the world to match.
right.
You can build stories that have nothing to do with your players, and they just go into it and there are no story elements that hook into their backstory. That's fine. I don't do that.
Right. So that does bring us to our third topic, which is incorporating the backstories of your players. Now, this is where you guys have been very different, whereas you build the world and the players kind of get stuck in that world one way or another, whether they're integrated well or not. But you talk to your players first while you're still in the process of building everything.
Backstory comes when I'm writing the story.
Right. So this is where, as DMs, you can either choose to do it where you've built the world, built everything else, and then you kind of, for lack of a better term, you shoehorn those characters' backstories into that world. Not necessarily like a
It's not a bad thing.
No, and that's why I'm just lack of a better
Yeah,
term.
it is a different way of doing it, but I still do agree with you. I do think that, having the backstory sort of tie in somehow in an arcing sort of way, I feel is important. But yeah, when I have a story, like it's sort of there, and then
Where can I
because
fit?
me as a DM, I would be afraid of falling into that pattern of like, let's say that I have a player who's a tiefling, and the big bad end is going to be a demon. Like, if I as a DM know that that player is going to be a tiefling, I don't want to like make the big bad a demon. But if I already have the demon and then the player decides to play a tiefling, then I don't feel so guilty.
And there's madness. There's
trying to say?
method to the
I'm not
madness.
trying to say anything.
What are you trying to say?
Nothing at all. I just mean like as a DM, I would be too tempted. You know what I mean?
See,
So I think
a lot
for
of this
me-
relies on the fact of your players and how in description they go with their backstories.
That's
and stuff
true
like
too.
that.
Like when I made like this is why I don't accuse you of that because. Or maybe I should because you made my backstory because I was a little baby player.
How do I make?
How I do this?
I got you. Don't worry.
I got you, demon.
See, but this is where definitely where if you're doing like a homebrew like original story versus a pre-made one, that's where you can. Some players will choose to either go ham and make a huge backstory and
Right.
go really in detail, or they make it more generic and have some details that are add to it. Like, for example, when we started playing Bards and Nobles with Brandon and he talked to us, we had very generic backgrounds. We didn't really want to go into in
I
depth.
had no background.
Well, partially because we didn't have a whole lot of knowledge in general, because again, we were very new players, and we were kind of relying on Brandon to do a little bit more, to kind of guide us.
And because he's a sadist.
Whereas, someone else comes in with all the ideas of their entire backstory
Right.
laid in, whereas we were starting to get with Zeke when he came up with Leon, he had like a 19-page backstory. It was he was ready to come in, but then it was like, oh, how much of this is going to fit in the world that you have, and this is where you talk to your DM. Versus a lot of times when we talk about your campaigns, you alter things when we come up with certain backstories. But I know as a player, I tend to leave a lot of things kind of vague. They all have certain maybe pinpoint parts in their life where something happens, but I leave it much more vague for the DM to incorporate that character easier into the world.
I just think about it this way. Like, for example, and this is, I'm not confirming or denying anything because you guys aren't too far in the campaign, but for example, if I'm making the world and I'm making the story and I make a decision to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to have gods walk the earth, I'm going to have that happen whether or not I have, like, some player who's playing a paladin or a cleric or it's something. I'm going to have that happen regardless.
Right.
So I think that's why I usually try to make the story and the world first. And then when I find out, what the players' backgrounds are, what they're playing as, or what they want to happen, like, then I'll incorporate that. Because I feel to me it's just better for me personally. I mean, I think that's just how I am. I mean, other DMs might disagree with me, but...
If you're a DM and you disagree, shut up. It's not your campaign. Well, I take a very defensive stance against other DMs who like to trash talk other DMs. It's not your game. You don't get to control it. Welcome to reality.
And again,
No, there's no
that is the whole point of these things. Is we're not telling anyone how they should do it. This is how you two, as experiences as DMs, are sharing how you guys kind of do things to maybe help people that are trying to learn it, see if they're trying to get more ideas on how they should do something. A lot of, it's that one way where I usually say, like, there's no wrong way, and granted, there is a wrong way, but it's to really emphasize that there's no one right way to do it.
Yeah.
There are several right ways. Like, when it comes to backstory, you drop them in after. I take them first because, as stated, we have a tiefling, and there is a demon issue. It's
I'm
not
a
the
tiefling.
end-all, be-all, but it is a major point, and I like to add that. That's why I like to get the backstory, because if they give me something from their backstory that I didn't think about, boom, I have a whole new storyline to work with. That I'm not like, okay, I'm gonna fit this backstory here, and I'm gonna have to work the with things around. I can go, okay, if I put this here, then I can I can add this block, but then I won't need this one, so I can add it with something else. So using the backstories either plays directly into what I've already have, and I can then enhance what I've made, or it gives me new tools to make a more immersive story for the player.
Right. I mean, this is where, as a DM, you can make choices. Like, for example, that we use the topic of, tieflings and then the big baddie being a
demon.
A demon. This is where, as a DM, you can either go, oh, yes, that tiefling is a descendant of that one. Oh, they're really involved now. They're kind of stuck with it. Or you can very well have it so the tiefling is not even related to the big baddie, and then that plays into it where, that tiefling is, let's say, for example, your tiefling that's a descendant of...
Grazit, just for an
Yeah, Greth, there you go.
And then, the big baddie is not that demon. It's like Yangu or something. And they go oh, you're a descendant of someone else. Pathetic. Only my own kin could even stand against me. And then you're like, As a player, you're like, screw you, yeah, like hell. And I'm a badass tiefling, and like, oh no, and it gives them a different motivation versus like, oh, I'm a descendant of you, I better defeat you.
Yeah. There's different ways to do it.
And this is where you can, and this is where your aspect of talking to the players, you can be like, okay, how would their character react about this? If it was their own, would they do anything
Do they
different?
know of it?
Or if they're so proud of their own heritage that they're going to defeat one that finds it differently. And that's just specifically with, this example of tieflings and Big Baddie being tiefling.
And I ask, give me as much information about your backstory as you want. I'll work it or I'll cut whatever I don't need. And if you don't give me information, you give me vague, I will then be allowed to interpret and make it as I see fit, close to what you'd want. I'm not going to be like, you didn't give me much, now you are this. And they're going to be like, I didn't want that. I'm not going to be like, well, that's your problem. I'm going to go, okay, so you do have wants and needs. Please tell me so then I can make it.
There is definitely something to be said about knowing your players. Because as you both know with me, I tend to keep things pretty vague because I enjoy learning a story. There's no point in me coming up with a backstory that's so in-depth that I don't learn anything new.
We can't pull from it.
Right.
We can't make new.
If I'm just like, hey, here's a character who's banished from a home for doing something that was against the clan, but he felt that it was still right. And then you're like, all right, cool. We'll play into that. Hey, look, your family's here. And they're not as mad as they were at one point. You're like, oh, that's a great thing to find out now. Versus,
your family hates you because you said they do, and they never want to see you again. So that plot point's gone.
Yeah, so that never happens again. Yeah. And I'm sure you're the same way because I know with your current campaign that we're in, I gave you, nothing. Yeah. I let you make the decision for a paladin. I was like, okay, you pick the devotion, you pick the god, you pick how I get integrated as a paladin,
And now you're stuck with my choices.
Yes.
Well, I, on the other hand, gave you room to make, but I gave you, this happened, this happened, this happened, I'm here, I'm doing this would be a cool concept, and you were like, I can do it, and you made it work.
You have a choose your own adventure versus I'm being given things, and this is just for your campaign right now because I like the idea of just learning as I go. Ooh, what's this character gonna get now?
Whereas I'm very much like the impatient type.
Give me everything.
I need everything. I need details right now.
I need the whole story synopsis on my desk by 5. We haven't started yet. I want the whole story.
I think it's actually really funny that you and I are kind of opposite in that way, mostly because I learned how to DM from you. You're my only.
I'm such
model.
a bad teacher.
No.
Everything has to be the opposite.
No, he's a great. I don't think it's.
Did
I don't
he
think
sneeze
it's a
during
difference
a game?
of.
I can never sneeze.
I don't think it's a difference of I don't like the way he does it. I'm gonna do it this way. I think it's just more my brain functions this style, so this is how I'm gonna do it because trying to do it that way just drives me insane.
Well, I think there's also something to be said that with two different personalities, you're going to do two different things. For example, Brandon as much like me, we're voice actors. You're not.
Yeah.
Whereas Brandon and I will go crazy with coming up with 100 different voices for things.
It's really hard for me to come up with voices.
Right, which is where
NPCs. I try real hard.
Which is why you can just say, as a DM, or if you're planning, you could say, this person says, and just do it. That's fine.
Right, and this is where we talked about with role-playing about if your character has a different voice than what you personally have, you could very well just describe it. And as a DM, you've done that, where you're like, I can't do this voice. You hear a dark, raspy voice come from the background, and you describe a villain, whereas you may drop your tone a little bit, but you're not going to be like Brandon and I, ooh, yes.
Who's going to, hurt our vocal cords in order to just say, 2 lines of dialogue.
Yeah. Or a whole monologue, and we're
I think it's just... I know you guys like it, so I try to.
And we appreciate that.
That's important.
Yeah.
Knowing what your players like and what they want, because even though you're a DM, I'm going off on an anti-DM. Come at me. Even though you're the DM and you get to make the story and you made the campaign and all the encounters and stuff, you're nothing without players. You can make your own story in your head, but you don't get to be a DM to an empty table. That's just you raving madly to yourself.
Right, because I think that's one of the...
Which can also be fun.
But not for everyone else.
That's got to be a big fear of a DM is losing players because of your DMing.
Yep.
Either A, you think you're so cocky it's never going to happen, they'll never find another DM, but then things like D20 roll around.
D20 exists, you can just find anybody.
Right, and so I think that has changed over the course of the years, and that we'll talk more about that in another time. But yeah, so integrating backstories into it, there's, again, 100 different ways, whether it's much more of Sam's of dropping characters and making them work kind of in there, especially if they give them a really vague, or Brand's of talking first to your players, finding out what characters you're going to have thrown in this world, and then making it work from there.
What is your plan for this character if everything goes smoothly? Because then I can go, everything's not going to go smoothly.
Because
Good luck.
because both of your guys, whatever style it is, you're going to run into players with a lot of vague, which gives you a lot of wiggle room to do things with, or you don't even have to figure everything out now.
Yeah.
Or you're going to
Yeah.
get people that are so detailed. Either A, you're going to have, if you do yours, either really work to change things to make it work, or tell them to change them themselves,
I
or
would never tell a player to change it themselves.
I would only
Right.
tell a player to change their backstory if it was outrageous
Yeah.
and like it's not going
Right.
to work anywhere.
If they're like, my dad was a superhero, my mom was a superhero, and I'm super powered, and everything's great, and I'm super special, then I'd be like, no, you're not.
You remember how you started level 1?
or if they're so detailed, whereas like with you can that could lend you to possibly build a whole section of your world a little bit more.
Where it makes the players feel valued.
Right.
Sure,
Like-
that's how we feel.
Well, I mean,
Valued.
it's one of those things where, like, we've talked.
your mouth.
We bring
Make
up
you feel valued.
we bring up a character like Leon Silvershadow, Zeke's character, where he really liked the idea of incorporating more Japanese culture into his character, and when he joined, I'm sure you had not incorporated Japanese culture into your.
What do you mean? Of course I did.
But since you felt strongly about that, you were like, okay, cool. I can alter, because again, we've only explored a little bit of the world at the time.
That much.
Yeah, very little. You could then alter things like, okay, he really wants this detailed part of his story. You're like, okay, I can mess with this enough to make it exist.
Yeah.
And that's where a benefit, I mean, partially, especially if you have characters that have only explored that much of a world, you can go back as a DM and be like, this part of the world's changed. Have a good day.
Yeah.
Magic happens. World-shaking events happen. This continent that was there...
You've shifted into a different dimension.
I mean, with that being said, even if you make your world ahead of time, there's still details that you can always change.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you're a DM. You control the
We
You're
can-
the damn, hey, guess what? A meteor just strikes that
I mean,
continent. It's gone now. It doesn't
If your
exist.
players
Well,
have a
there's
gripe
nothing to
with
say
it.
that you can't even expand the world. Like, you may have drawn a map of the world. I highly doubt you made a globe. If you did, kudos to you. I mean, you made a globe. But
I did.
kudos to you. You made a globe.
The map is... It's just a
Well,
flat
no.
globe.
But the point I'm making is you didn't make a full-on like actual like.
No, I didn't make a... But it's
but
it's
you-
a
So you
spherical
can always
map.
be like, you thought this was the world? Well, guess what? It's this now.
Right, there could be a section that you've like, but except for this area up here, you've noticed that there's a whole other continent for XYZ.
Yeah, I can't do that. Me personally, in our campaign, I can't do that.
You could.
I have given you that wraps and that wraps.
Right.
I can
That's
add
what
tiny
we-
things undiscovered in the ocean.
I could make it happen.
Or portals to other
But
worlds.
yeah, or, the easiest cop out is, you went through a portal, welcome to this other dimension.
And so yeah, there's a number of different. But we're getting off tangent at this point. But so those are the three topics that are probably the best way to begin.
You've put the ground foundation now.
Oh,
you're-
it should be noted there's one other important thing you need before you can run a campaign, and that's players.
But we'll get into that.
Well, I mean, you players because you need backstories. So I think
We'll get into that.
Yeah, so this is just a one part of an ongoing series as far as building a campaign to help you if you're looking into becoming a DM. Kind of the bits and pieces that you might want to look about when you're starting to build something for your players to do, whether that is for a one shot or a full on campaign. So until we see you guys next time, D10tion dismissed.